Hi, my name's Phil. I like to talk about politics. In this video, I'd like to discuss one of the promises that Boris Johnson seems to be breaking the quickest. So as a reward for all those working people voting Conservative, he is now moving to swiftly remove their rights. But first, if you'd like to see more of my videos, then please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So EU standards on workers' rights were going to be enshrined in law as part of the withdrawal agreement negotiated by Theresa May's government. Then came Boris Johnson, who instantly moved the workers' and environmental rights, or protections in the case of the environmental legislation, from the legally binding portion of the withdrawal agreement, which we'd have to stick to the political declaration, which we wouldn't. Now, that was a good indicator that he intended to throw workers' rights onto the bonfire after Brexit. He protested this by saying, no, I actually want to strengthen workers' rights. But EU regulations are a minimum standard. We would be free to raise them to the rafters if we wanted. Lots of countries do raise their worker rights in other parts of the EU. It's only in this country with Conservative governments that we basically just stick to the minimum. So no, he wanted to abolish them altogether, and so hiding them in the political declaration, which is not legally binding, was the first step. But now, buoyed up by his massive majority in Parliament, he's gone a step further. In fact, he's rushed to do two things to obliterate what workers' rights we have. Actually, there's several, but two that I'm going to talk about, which were never above those minimum EU standards under a Conservative government, as I say, anyway. So the first one is that he began by announcing plans to allow more junior courts, shall we say, to reinterpret EU court rulings. Now, as a member of the EU, when an employer or employee, come to that, wants to push a particular piece of employment legislation, it is the EU court's interpretation that holds sway. The exception in the UK is the Court of Session in Scotland and the Supreme Court for the UK in general, and they can deviate from that interpretation. That is because they are constitutional courts. But other courts, including the High Court in England, are not, and so they have to defer to EU ruling. So if an employer wishes to take an employee to court or vice versa, it will be the EU ruling, the EU interpretation that holds sway. But Boris Johnson wants other judges to be able to form their own interpretations and deviate from the EU's. And bear in mind that the guidelines for interpretations for those judges would be formulated by Johnson's government. Now, what this means in effect is that, let's say your employer wants to take away some of your employment rights. You only have those employment rights due to a ruling in an EU court. So they can put the case to a lower court in the UK, because your employer can't just go straight to the Supreme Court, and ask a British judge to make a ruling. That judge won't have to defer to the EU ruling and will be following guidance, as I say, from the UK government. Needless to say, there will be judgments that do not favour the employees. So you can expect lots of these cases to come to court once it's all been enacted. The second example comes in the form of the Withdrawal Bill itself. So the Withdrawal Bill is the way in which you implement the withdrawal agreement and set it in British law. And it's currently making its way back through Parliament. Now, there are a few little gaps in the bill that Johnson has his majority now. He can do what he wants. So, for example, Clause 34. Now, that was for the protection of workers' rights. It's gone. Apparently, it's just disappeared. Maybe it fell out, eh? So before putting workers' rights in the political declaration, that meant that the government was not committing to maintaining them, but it was at least claiming to saying that it intended to keep them. We'd like to keep them, is what it was saying. Now it's not even doing that. The withdrawal agreement isn't changing. The withdrawal agreement itself isn't changing. Just to be clear, this is just the wording of the bill, but the bill is what is going to put things into UK law. What it does mean is that those workers' rights will not be ending up as UK law as soon as we're properly out of the EU. Now that'll be to take effect, I guess, in 2021, of course. We'll still be in the EU in a sense, even when we've left next month. That is to say, although we won't be members anymore at the end of January, we will still have to follow all the EU's rules until we leave without a deal. But with the pace at which this is happening, Boris Johnson is clearly intending that we deregulate almost immediately upon ending the transition period. It's also a clear sign of intending to do so without a trade deal. After all, he knows that any free trade agreement with the EU means that we'd have to protect certain standards for EU citizens in the UK at least. There is no way that the EU could agree to a deal that means the UK gets to treat EU citizens like crap. And that will include EU citizens living and working in the UK, which will still be happening on some level even after we've left. So if Boris Johnson really wanted a deal, why waste parliamentary time implementing systems that he will never give the green light to? Because he can't. The EU cannot accept those terms in a trade deal because they're screwing their own people over. I mean, unlike in this country where, let's be honest, we don't really rise up and protest. There are lots of EU countries where they do. France, most notably. And so they'd never get away with it, even if they wanted to do that. So the only explanation is that he definitely wants the no-deal Brexit. He's just willing to delay it by a year so that he can claim the consequences as someone else's fault. There were people musing, and it was reasonable to do so, I did it myself, with a massive majority, might he soften his approach to Brexit? No, this action says not at all, full steam ahead. And if I can work this out, I'm pretty sure the EU team will have done as well. So I'm now wondering what approach they're going to take with the negotiations with that in mind. I mean, this action by Boris isn't about threatening a no deal. This is about making no deal the goal, the aim, the thing he wants. And with the real level of unemployment getting higher all the time, in fact, even their own fiddle figures show it's getting higher now, the worsening of workers' rights could increase dramatically because it's not like workers will have the option of leaving a bad employer to find one that appreciates them more. Because just because you get rid of workers' rights in law, employers can still build certain rights and better working conditions into the contract to attract the better staff. But that only works at times of very low unemployment. And of course it will hit the lowest skilled and lowest paid workers worst of all. There are sections of the economy, of course, with skill shortages. So those who have those skills will possibly be protected from the worst of these changes. But those who switched their support from Labour to the Conservatives last week, well, most of them have just voted to make their working conditions much worse. Maybe they don't like quality time with their families. Maybe that's it. And all of this is to say nothing of other announcements that will impact it as well. So his promise on the minimum wage, that will not now be honoured. We knew that anyway, because although they were all saying, oh yeah, the minimum wage is going to rise up to this. Although he said that, when you looked at the fine print in what they published, it did say, as long as the economic conditions are right. They didn't say that at all to the public. They're now saying it, and they did write it down, and that's what happens when you don't read the fine print. Also, he's banning all-out strikes on public transport as well. So, yeah. I said yesterday in a video, didn't I, that the scale of support towards the Conservatives from the working classes last week meant that you could vote Conservative and probably not even be quiet about it. I'm sure there's working class people around admitting to voting Tory and being quite pleased about it, knowing they're surrounded by others who've done the same. So yeah, you could loudly and proudly say you voted Tory in quite a lot of traditional Labour heartlands now. But maybe you can't. Maybe I'm wrong about that, because it might just be that in just over a year's time, it becomes the least fashionable thing on earth for a worker to admit to having voted for them, as those who did not look angrily on. And that is something to consider, isn't it? Polls have been saying for quite a long time that a majority in the UK wanted to cancel Brexit. A majority of people voted for parties committed to giving us another vote on it, with Remain as an option. People should remember that the only majority for Brexit in the whole of the United Kingdom resides entirely within the Palace of Westminster. Only in the House of Commons specifically. Only in Parliament. And that, as those who wanted to stay are hurt more and more by what is to come, their resentment will grow stronger. Or maybe the government will just bullshit them into submission. Who knows? I don't know. We'll have to find out, I suppose. So I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, then please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.